valley. So the first way to start is when you take a ride up the Casey Highway at night and you look down in the valley, you see nothing but lights. You go down in the daytime, you see nothing but buildings. The Indians that lived here before we came here seen nothing but trees. That was it. There were streams, there was river, there were lakes, and there was just game. They had moose, they had elk, they had rabbits, they had fox, they had ducks, they had waterfowl, pheasants, rabbits. That's what they lived on. It was very plentiful here. The fish in the rivers, the trout was amazing. And they, when you think about it, you think of how, you know, they just fed themselves off the land, and you know, that's where it all started. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to start by reading from the papers that I wrote, because I'm never going to remember every single thing. But to learn a little bit about the Indians, we have to learn about where they began and how they came here and how they came to this valley. And you're starting with what they call the Paleo Indians. That would be the Indians that followed the wandering herds of animals, the large dinosaurs and things like that. And they ended up coming here during the Ice Age. They traveled across the Bering Strait. They came down here hunting large animals, like bisons and mammoths and all kinds of things. And then after that, after the Ice Age receded, some stayed here. But that's where the Indians came from. They came across the ocean from other parts. That's why some of the Indians look Asian. Some of them look darker skinned than others. Some are lighter skinned. And they formed nations around here. And around here we have the nation of Indians. And there was actually the 5 nations. And amongst the 5 nations, there was, in our area here, part of them are some of my relatives.
You're part Indian?
Yes, my mother was part Seneca Indian.
Oh,
so that's why I have a little bit more of an interest in this than some other people would have. But the Confederation of 6 nations consisted of the Mohawks, the Senecas, the Onondagas, the Oneidas, the Cayugas, and the Tuscaroras. Now, if those names sound familiar to you, it's because you go up into the Finger Lakes, and those lakes are named after these Indians. A lot of the names that we have around here are named after Indians. Nanaco is an Indian name, and it's part of an Indian nation. Tunkhannock, the Lackawanna River, was named after the Indians. It was called the Lackawan, Lackawan. They had a whole bunch of different pronunciations for it. But all of that came to be part of what we had here. But the period, that Paleo period, they were like wandering bands. They were hunters. They followed the large, and that was around 12,000 BC. Then after that became the Archaic period, and that's when after the glaciers receded, and they started to develop and they make crude tools, axes, spears, woodworking tools, but they were still a wandering band of hunters. They never settled. They just kept walking and hunting, and they'd stay overnight. They'd stay for a little week or so, and they just kept moving. And around 1500 BC was what they called the traditional period, the transitional period, where they started making bowls and better tools. They got more advanced weaponry. Their projectiles had better points on them, able to kill a little bit better. They used soapstone for bowls to make their bowls out. They carved the soapstone and made bowls out of it. And that went from that period to about 1000 BC. And then from 1000 BC to 1500 AD, they started to develop culture. And they started settling in villages and families, and they started planting crops, making pottery, and they started by planting sunflowers, sunflower seeds, tobacco, and corn. And they did a lot of planting. They became farmers. They became more civilized. And they all congregated in this area where we live. You don't think of German, because it's such a small area, it wouldn't be like a big Indian village, because there was not a lot of room. But just to the south of us, and there's a lot of history that comes down from that area. But right by, there's a big railroad yard. It's called the Coxton Yards. That was one of the big Indian village, and I'm going to try to pronounce the name of the village if I can. It was called Asserughney, Osserughney, but that was the name of the village. That was the village that was, if you're going down Kaiser Avenue and you go into Old Forge and go into DuPont and Duryea, it's on the right-hand side, right where the Lackawanna River empties out into the Susquehanna River. That was a giant village. They found hundreds and hundreds of artifacts there. They're still digging there. I've been down there for years and years and years getting topsoil out of there. And they had tents set up where the archaeologists were working there. And right above that, if you go up the Susquehanna River, there's a great big ledge on the right-hand side. And that ledge is called Campbell's Ledge. And it's written in history books, some of the first books in this area, because that's where the Indians used to light their morning fires on top of that rock to let the other Indians know that the gigantic Susquehannock Indians were coming down the river. And they were one of the largest bands of Indians. Now, I'm going to pass these out. These are what I've taken from a couple of different books that I've gotten to read. These are canoes that were found locally in different ponds. Some of them are in museums. This is the Lestrange Pond Canoe and the Carr Pond Canoe, and I'll pass them around this way. Everybody can read about them and look at them. These are dugout canoes. This is the Popack Creek Canoe, and I'll get into telling you a little bit more about the Indians and how they lived here. Now, this is the Mud Pond Canoe. This is local. This is a little bit closer to us. Lake Winola, there's one. Mud Pond, Harvey's Lake, Popack Creek, the Delaware River, Cold Springs in Wayne County. These are all places where they found old Indian canoes.
What was that 30 years ago? That they found in Chapman Lake.
There was one found in Chapman Lake. And there was an Indian settlement at Chapman Lake. That tells us how close we are to where the Indians actually settled. What Indians did was they settled at the mouths of rivers, and they settled along the rivers, and they settled at lakes because of the fishing. And then in wintertime, they would move their villages to the mountains where they would get away from the wind and away from the heavy snows, and they'd get onto the eastern and the northern sides of away from the wind, where the wind would blow from the south and it would blow from the west. And they would get into caves and they'd build little lean-tos and stuff like that. And when they walked and traveled, they didn't travel in the valleys. They hunted in the valleys, but they traveled along the mountains. But they never traveled to the very top of the mountain. They traveled just down off the top of the mountain so that they could see what was down in this valley. And they'd walk on the other side of the mountain so they could see what was down in the other valley. And one of the valleys that they looked at was this valley here and the valley on the other side. So when you're looking at going down towards Scranton, you see the big mountain on the right-hand side. On both sides of that mountain, the Indians would look down into the valleys to see the other Indians that had villages, and when white people started moving in here, they would be able to see the smoke from a cabin, and then they would know that there was white people here. And that's how they determined that. Now these are rubbing stones. These are stones that the Indians used to use to rub their cornmeal, to sharpen their tools. This is what they used, and you'll feel it. You can feel how it fits into your hand, and that's the way they rub it. You'll see black markings on it where they pounded on it. And
Yep. The village on the west of the field, I heard that.
yeah, and getting to that too, you see all the black markings on the bottom of this where they pounded and they rubbed, and that's how they worked. The men would use this for their tools, sharpening their axes and things like that. And in here you'll see, I'll pass this around. This has what they made their weapons out of. These are pieces of flint that they would find in this area, and they would sharpen and make cutting tools, scraping tools, tools for doing their hides from the animals to make them into coats and make them into different things. And then they would take and cut the strands off of the Indians, off the deer hides, and make string so that they could tie it to tie their weapons to sticks to make spears and to make arrows. And the bullets that are in here, they're not Indian, but that's what the Indians got killed with in the 1800s by the white man when they came here. One of the things about Indian lore, it was one of the things that was very prevalent in the Boy Scouts. When we went to Boy Scout camp, every single camp that we had an Indian name. And the Boy Scouts taught a lot about Indian lore and Indian history. So I just brought some things about the Indians. All these patches that we had when we were in the Boy Scouts have Indian figures on them. It was a big part of growing up and working in the woods as a kid. They have canoes on them. And this is what the arrowheads look like. I mean, this is just a replica shape of an arrowhead. Well, what they would do is this like be a spearhead. They would take this, put a stick on the back of it, and they would tie it, lash it with the string that they got from animal hides, and that's how they would tie them up. And then they would make little leather things out of the leather hides, and they would sew them. This is what the Boy Scouts did, but they would make them with real hides from the animals. When I was in the Boy Scouts, I had the great opportunity to travel to New Mexico, and while I was in New Mexico at the Boy Scout camp, we went to one of the campsites, which was called Indian Writings. And at Indian Writings, there was an archaeological dig where they were digging and finding the Indian bones, animal bones, campfires, teepees, things like that. And on the rocks, you'll see Indian writings on the walls, where they carved writings on the walls. So I'll pass them around as well. This book, The Trail of the Seneca, this book is actually a book about our area to the north of us, but where the Senecas live. And it's a very good book. It tells you a lot about Indians, how they attacked the white settlers, how they tried to get along with the white settlers, how some of the white settlers really tried to be friendly with the Indians, and then how other Indians attacked them. The Indians relied on the birds. They used the feathers in their headdresses. They would wear a feather in the back of their head as a braid. The chiefs wore big headdresses with many feathers in them, and they got the feathers from the geese, they got the feathers from the turkeys, and they got the feathers from all the different migratory birds. But they very seldom ever would use the feathers from an eagle, because they didn't kill the eagles. The eagles were almost like a god to them. So I took a picture of an eagle, so this is what the Indians revered and part of their lore and their history.
Were the Seneca Indians, were they in this area?
Yes. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a rundown, and I'm gonna have to read a lot of it because there's a lot that I can't remember off the top of my head. But the Indian nation that was here was the Iroquois nation. And the Iroquois nation was made up of a lot of different Indians. The Delaware was part of the Iroquois nation. The Senecas were part of the Iroquois nation. The Mohawks were a little bit farther to the north. The Shawnee Indians came from the Everglades down south, and they came up the Chesapeake and then up the Susquehanna River, and they settled as far north here as Nanticoke. And they were forced out of here in around 1755, They settled here in the 1740s and 50s, but they were forced out of here around 1758 when the white settlers started coming in here. They ended up going north, and like all the Indians, they ended up going north and west. One of the smaller villages, but a large village for this area, was Capoose Meadows, which is Capouse. Capoose was the Indian chief of the Munsee tribe or the Mincie tribe. They were part of the Lenni Lenape Indians, which is part of the Delaware Indians. And what they were is they were the outcasts of the Delaware, because they tried to make friends with the white settlers, and they tried to trade land to the settlers and gave up some land. And the Delaware Indians called them women, and chased them out of their area and made them settle down here in Scranton. So Chief Capoose he was the chief of the small Mincy or Muncie tribe, but they were not fierce warriors or anything anymore. They were passive. They made cabins out of birch wood and bark wood, green wood, used straw to pack it in, and they lived in little huts, not teepees and things like you'd see on TV. I had the great pleasure to dig for an archaeological expedition, and I actually dug for 3 or 4, but the big one was up in Tunkhannock. It is right where they built the new bypass. And in that development, they found a massive amount of Indian arrowheads, pottery, shards of different things. I actually had to go with a geologist, and they had me dig a pit where they went down into the ground and they took and scraped the walls, and they layered the periods of where the people lived here. And I went down in with this young lady that she was a phenomenal, knowledgeable person. And what she did was she would explain to me, because they couldn't get over the fact that I had such an interest in it, because most people they get to dig for them, they rip everything apart and just rip it and carry. And they asked me if I could dig 6 inches at a time with the machine so that they could get things. And I actually was so meticulous about not destroying anything that I would pick up an arrowhead with the tip of the bucket and give it out so that they couldn't get over that. The head archaeological person from the state of Pennsylvania came up and asked if I could travel with them to every one of their sites to do their digging for them, because they couldn't get over the fact that I actually had an interest in it. And it was a funny story is every day at lunch those people would walk across that field, and every day they'd go to the bathroom in the woods. They didn't have porta-johns or anything, and they would go to the bathroom in the woods and come back, and they'd bring back an arrowhead. When they'd walk across the field, they'd find it. So I spent an hour every day for about 3 months that I worked there, walking up and down that field looking for arrowheads, and never seen one. I found nuts and bolts and pieces of steel, and I came back and I said, how come I can't? I said, I have great vision and I'm looking. They said, well, you don't have the equipment, so you're finding what you. I said, I'm not looking for that. I'm looking for arrowheads. I can't. They said we just have an eye for it. Wow. And they come back and they were bringing things from the archaic period, from the modern period. They had all kinds, and they would go back years and years and years. And what they did was, when you take off the topsoil and you get to the dirt would be brown like this table, and then you would see a hole that was black in the ground, and then you'd see another one, and then you'd see another one, and then you'd see another one, and they'd come over and they'd say that was the fire pit. Those were the stakes where they put the kettle on top of the fire to roast or whatever, not the kettle, but their pot. And then they'd show me more ones where there'd be 8 or 10 or 12 in a round circle, and they would be the posts of their teepees. And what they did was when the villages got raided and burnt, everything became carbon and charred and stayed in the ground. And those black marks were the actual wood that was pounded in the ground to build their teepees. So it was fascinating for me. A lot of what I learned about the Indians locally, I got from this book. It's called Falling Feathers, and it's written by a girl up here, and she's part of the Wayne County Historical Society. And there's a lot. You just flip through this, and you're going to see a lot of what I'm talking about, and you'll get a little bit of a better picture of the Indians. One of the other Indians that was around here locally, other than Chief Capoose, was Chief Tedious-Skunk. And Chief Tedious-Skunk was another Delaware Indian who sold off his land and became an outcast of the rest of the Delaware, who were the fierce warrior Indians. And they sort of pushed him back to this area. And in 1742, he went to Philadelphia, I believe it was July 12th, to a big, large conference with the governor of the state of Pennsylvania. And they tried to negotiate getting the land back that they sold the white settlers. And at that time, there was another chief, and if I can find the page real quick. His name was Chief Kennesateague, and he was the chief of the Delaware Indians that were up here, and he called Tediascung a woman and said that you should be ashamed of yourself for giving up your land to the white man and now trying to get it back by talking. And they had all the chiefs of all the different tribes, and they later ended up killing Tediascung. He actually was in a drunken stupor because the Indians loved to drink after they found out what alcohol was. And he was in a, I guess in a tent, and they burnt the tent down with him in it, and he was killed by other Indians. And that was in the 1700s. The great city of the Indians, the largest city, which actually, it's unusual for them to call it a city, but that was the largest group of Indians in this area, is right where Syracuse is now. That was the big city of all the Indians, and it was, it had a name, and let's see if I can come up with it. I think it was Onondaga, and that's where all of the Indians came from. And they had their own chiefs at the time, like at that point. And then they had, what they had was they had a chief, and then they had a council of braves. And the council of braves sat with the chief around their fires and made the decisions on what they were going to do, where they were going to attack, what peoples they were going to take over, and different things like that. The first white settlers, when they came here, there was a combination of the Connecticut settlers and the Quakers. They were both given this land by the King of England, and they fought over it, and we ended up with different wars. And the first settlers that came here came down and tried to settle in the valley, which is down in Scranton, where they met Capels. And they'd build a cabin, and the Indians would come down out of the mountains, and they'd burn the cabin, chase the people away. Then more Connecticut settlers would come, and they'd do the same thing. And then the Quakers would come, and the Indians would do the same thing. So then they started building forts. And down in, right there past where that Indian village is, there were like 3 or 4 forts put in there. They're right at where the bridge goes over the river, the first bridge, which goes over to West Pittston. Right on the corner, just before you get to that, there was a fort on the left-hand side. As soon as you go over the bridge, to the right-hand side was another fort. And then when you go down the river this way, there was the Wyoming fort, and then there was another fort, and there was big Indian villages going all the way down the river. One of the largest ones of the people that were shipped out, like the Munsee tribe that were outcasts of the Delaware, was in Chinook, where one of the largest Indian villages was going down the river. I'm going to read some stuff because there's a lot here. But on these papers here that I have, these are some of the paths that the Indians took. And one of the paths is the Lackawanna Path. And the Lackawanna Path ran from the Indian town at the mouth of the Lackawanna, which is the one down by Campbell's Ledge, down by the Coxton Yards. And it ran just north of Pittston, that's where it started. And it came up through Capoose Meadows, which is Scranton, which was the Providence section where Tripp's Park is, the Tripp's home was. And then it turned left and went up through the Notch, towards Clark Summit. And some of the history says it went up by, I can't think of the name of the pond. It's right up here in Scott Township, where Dick Muehlheisen lived. Sickler's Pond. It went up by Sickler's Pond, and then it traveled north to Windsor, New York. And that was called the Lackawanna Path. There was a path where the warriors all used to travel along the river. It went all the way along the Susquehanna River and went up through, because some of the first white settlers that came here traveled that way. Now, you all remember the history of our country that you read and learned about in school, and you remember Captain John Smith. Well, Captain John Smith came up the Susquehanna River, and he met the Indians and wrote about the Indians that he met. There was a guy named Brule, B-R-U-L-E, with a little French hyphen over it, that he came down from Canada, and he met with the French, but he came down from the mouth of the Susquehanna, which is where we went on our trip to Cooperstown, because that's the beginning of the Susquehanna River. So they followed the Susquehanna River all the way down. They met a large group of Indians that lived up by Binghamton along that river there, that part of the river. There was a big Indian village there. And then they came down the Susquehanna, and that's where they met the Susquehannock Indians. The Susquehannock Indians were called giants. They were much larger than any other Indians, and nobody knows why or what, but they towered over every white man and every Indian around. They were the Susquehannock Indians. They were the fiercest warriors, and they lived up in the northern parts of the Susquehanna River, Tunkhannock, Wyalusing, all the way up through that area. They traveled up and down the river raiding the other Indian villages, and they came here and warred against the white man when the white man came. And there were other paths. Now, one of the paths that the Indians used came from the Delaware Valley, Delaware River Valley, which is up towards Milford, Matamoros, in that area. And they came down through some of the towns that we know, and a lot of the roads that we drive on are the original Indian paths. Because what the Indians did was they traveled on these paths and beat them down, wore them so much by traveling, that the white man said, well, if they were good enough for the Indians, they're good enough for us. So what they did was they just made them a little bit wider so that they would now take a wagon instead of just a footpath. And then they became a little bit wider so that the settlers started developing these paths, and they became our roads. That's what we have today. Not our major highways, but our secondary roads. Now there's a road that goes up, that travels up around Mount Cobb and travels up towards Lake Wallenpaupack. It's 348 into 590. That was one of the original Indian trails. It takes you all the way up around Lake Wallenpaupack, because Lake Wallenpaupack wasn't there. It wasn't a lake. It was a stream, and PP&L dammed that up and made it a lake. That was all just a natural wooded area, but Wallenpaupack Creek is well known in these books and in writings with the Indians. So they would travel from that part of the country to here because they congregated around the Delaware River, the Susquehanna River, the Ohio River. That's where the main campgrounds were, their main hunting areas, and then they came to this area. So we had Indians like Capoose who lived down here, and he hunted and traveled according to all of the writings that we could find in all of the histories of Lackawanna, in all of the libraries and books that were written by Hollister and Troop and different people that were first settlers here. They talked about how Capoose, his hunting grounds, went from where he lived down in Scranton or Providence at the time, all the way up to the headwaters of the Lackawanna. So this was his valley. He came up this valley and hunted all the way up to where the river starts, which is up towards Ararat. You go through Simpson and through Fort City, Van Lingen, and keep going and up to where the mouth of the river starts. That was his hunting grounds. So naturally, you're going to find things around here that would tell you that the Indians lived here. There were great mounds of burial grounds that were found in Providence, which were the Indian burial grounds. They were raided by some of the first settlers here. In fact, it was talked about in a book by, I think his name is Isaiah Troop. He was one of the founders. The troop was named after him. But he had a large collection of Indian artifacts that were taken from these burial grounds. They had hatchets, and they had pottery, and they had the spearheads and arrowheads and things like that they accumulated by raiding these burial grounds and the areas around it. So there was quite a few mounds around here that they had taken. So a lot of the early artifacts are gone. Now there's some legends around here about Indians. Over here in the Archibald Mountain, it's called, actually one of the environmental areas is called Indian Cave Wetlands area. So it's even on some of our maps now when I'm working here, when we go up into that area, it's called Indian Caves Wetlands. And there were Indian caves over here by 40-Foot Falls and up in that area. that Indians had settled in, lived in. Up on the black ledges and white ledges, just going out of German, there was Indian relics found there. There were hatchets found. There were different things. People who lived before us, they would go up there and find this stuff, and then it'd get traded, it'd get sold, and you know, there's not a lot around now. It's hard to find any of that stuff. But I was with the company that I'm working for. We're working along the Susquehanna River, and guy Keith Eckel owns a lot of that land, and he farms it. He plants it all the time. It's corn because that's what the Indians planted. They planted corn, so we plant corn in the same place. They taught us how to plant corn. So in that field, you'll find that flint in a whole bunch of different places all through those fields. The other day, after we had a really heavy rain, it was about a month ago, we had a really heavy rain, and I was driving through there, and there was 3 people walking through the field, and they were looking for arrowheads. And I called them over and asked them if they found anything, and the one guy said he's been doing it for about 6 or 7 years now, and he said he's got hundreds and hundreds of arrowheads that he's found in those areas. He said there are Indian ovens up in that area, in the rocks, and he knows where they are. There was an Indian cabin that's still up in the woods, part of it's still up in the woods, he knows where that is. And he also was telling me that they used to have their own type of mailbox when the white people first came here, and the Indians still tried to live in harmony with them. But up in that same field is a big cemetery, well, a little cemetery. It's a small, little gated cemetery, and a lot of the people that were killed in the Wyoming Massacre are in that cemetery. And the first white settler and the first white cabin in this area was in that area right there. The guy's name was Gardner, and he was actually scalped by Indians on the other side of the river. And one of the stories I heard was he was stuck with porcupine quills, and they had like, almost, it would be like diesel fuel or whatever, but they had some kind of a fuel oil that they used back then, and they put it on these quills, and they would stick him, like every time he would try to break away or something, they would stick more quills in.
Really?
And then eventually they just lit them on fire, and they burned them to death, which is, I mean, it's today, by today's standards, that would be torture, and it's torture by any standard, but that's what the Indians did back then. There was a white cabin in Scranton where the Indians came up down off the mountain, and they took the kids, and the kids escaped. One kid was taken, he was a boy, his name was Tripp, he was one of the Tripp family. He was taken all the way up into New York State, and he escaped and found his way back here to tell the story about it. But there were 2 people captured, and they took them up through the notch in Clark Summit. 2 Indians had 2 people, and they had another white man with them. And one Indian took the 2 people up along a creek, and it says it's the first creek as you go up through the notch, which would be one of the creeks off to the right, coming down by Layton Road that way in Clark Summit. And they took, and the Indian came back by himself, didn't come back with the 2 people that they took into the woods. And they said in the 1800s, hunters found the skulls of 2 people in that area, so we know that they were killed in that area. So I mean, there's a lot of history in this area here, so that we know that they lived here. I'll pass these around. These are actual writings about the war paths and maps of where the paths are, so you can get an idea. You can read a little bit about it if you want to. Those are the maps. And I've got probably 20 pages here. If I was to read all this, we'd be here all night. And I can go into it in depth, and there's so much, I mean, about the treaties between the Indians back in the 1758. They had a conference in Easton with the Indians, and then all about the French and Indian Wars, all about the Tories, how the Tories got the Indians together, and that's what, they were the ones that attacked the fort at Wyoming during the Wyoming Massacre. And then how General Sullivan came, and he took and followed. General Sullivan was a British general before the Revolution, and he followed the Indians after the Wyoming Massacre, and he went along the Susquehanna River. There are plaques all along the river where General Sullivan traveled, and if you ever want to see some history, just take a ride down to Pittston, to Duryea, and just before you get to Pittston, you'll see a plaque where there was a railroad yard and there was a mine shaft disaster on the right. Go a little farther, there's one on the left where Fort Pittston was, and then you'll go across the bridge and there's another one where Fort Jenkins was, and then you go a little farther and you'll see a sign where General Sullivan traveled this path and he camped in this spot. That was the first place he camped after seeing the Wyoming Massacre, and then going on, that was his first night camp. Then you go up over the next hill and there's another marker, and it's called Wyomtomic. And at that point, it's on top of a hill, and you'll look down, the river's down right below you. And on the other side of the river was where the Indian village was, and it tells you a little bit about the Indian village. And then you travel up along the Susquehanna, and that's where General Sullivan went. And when he got up, what he did was he attacked every village that he could. Most of the villages were empty because the Indians knew that he was coming, and they vacated. They just took off to New York to their main villages. But when he got up to what is now around Elmira, there was called the Newton Battlefield. And up in the Newton Battlefield was where General Sullivan had the first real battle with the Indians. And he killed all of the Indians that were there. And then he proceeded from that point to the Finger Lakes and attacked and burned every village. Went around the Finger Lakes up to the Great Lakes, attacked every Indian village there. Came back down around the Great Lakes and came back down towards the Delaware River and back down through the valley back to Philadelphia, Easton, Bethlehem area. And that was General Sullivan's March, which is very famous in history. And that was just down the road from where we are. It came right up through there. The Indians, they're portrayed throughout our history. You see them on TV, you see Tonto, and you see, all of the Indian westerns that we had. And the Indians were part of our history. They were put on coins. We have the Indian head pennies. We have the buffalo nickel on the face. The buffalo's on one side, the Indian face is on the other side. Gold coins had the Indian head on it. Probably 10 or 12 different early Indian coins or American U.S. coins had Indian heads on them. And that's how we can keep knowledge of them. I was at an auction Sunday and I bought some stuff. I bought some stamps and coins, and in it, I wanted this more than anything. I ended up buying half of stuff I didn't want, but I ended up buying this. This is official U.S. tribute to the Native Americans. And it's got stamps of the Indians. And one of the most famous ones is Jim Thorpe, locally. Jim Thorpe, he was an Indian, of course. A lot of people know his history. He was an Olympic champion. He was a football player. He was a great athlete, tremendous athlete, and his body was taken and buried in Jim Thorpe, which was Malchunk at the time, an Indian name, and it became known as Jim Thorpe. But his picture's in here on a stamp, and their Indian headdresses are in here. And in the back is an Indian collection, and it's Indian head pennies and the buffalo nickel, but it shows the Indian head on the buffalo nickel. So I'll pass that around, you can look at that. And there's so much more that I could talk about. There's so many things about the Indians. I could probably go for another hour or 2 hours on the history of all this stuff, but you'd be bored to death. But the Indians are still in the area. They're just a different type of Indian now. They're called the Lakeland Chiefs. And that's the end of my story for now. But I would be glad to answer any questions if anybody has questions on the Indians. And these pages are completely filled with history of the Indians. And it would take easily an hour to go over all of the things on the Indians, all of the black Minkas, and all about Captain John Smith and the Dutch traders and the fur traders. Some of the first traders that came through this area that met the Indians. There was an Indian guide here that went to up and down this valley, taking the people to the coal deposits when they were first coming here in the 1808s, 1804s, in the early part of the 1800s. There was an Indian guide that traveled this road all the way up, and there was a road which was an Indian path along the river. And then it became a wagon trail path, and we actually found that part of that trail that still exists just north of Mayfield Bridge in along the river. There's a cobblestone path along the river that's just about as wide as a wagon, and it bends with the river, and it's down at the base. I love looking for stuff like that. We probably could still find Indian relics up here in the caves in the mountains. We could probably still find them if we dug the fields around the Chapman Lake, Hart Lake, Newton Lake, because that's where they live. And if you know, we didn't develop the way we developed and just dug and opened up the ground and just cast it away, we would find a lot of those relics. But a lot of people they would just dig and build a home and never really pay attention to what was going on. So we lost a lot of artifacts. And there's still more to be found, but the problem is now contractors just don't look at them. So if there's any questions, anybody have any questions, or if they know of something Indian that they would like to have something answered that I maybe could answer them, I'd be glad to answer it.
Was there really gold buried up there at the 40-foot falls?
Really gold? If I had it, I would be able to tell you that. The story is that there was. The story is there was a lead mine here. There were salt mines here. There was a silver mine here, and there was a gold mine here. To get to the story of the gold mine, when one of the people was taken by the Indians here, they took him up on the mountain, and the mountain is this way from Scranton to your west, up on top of the mountain. And they said that the Indians moved a large rock, and underneath the rock was a continuously moving spring. And then they would take the neckerchief from the person that they captured, and the story in the book is that they dipped the neckerchief in the water to wipe his brow. And on the neckerchief was gold flakes on the neckerchief. It came from the running water of the spring. The silver mine, the talk of the silver mine was Count Zeissendorfer was one of the first people ever to come to this area and meet the Indians. And there's a story about him. He settled on a rock down between Wyoming and the settlement in the corner there by the Lackawanna Mouth, and he talked to the Indians. And the story is that the Indians wanted to kill him because they were afraid that he was going to find their silver mine. And he was in like a teepee at the time, a tent that he had set up. He was in there, and he had a fire lit in the tent. And the Indians had come around the tent, and they were going to kill him. But where he set that fire was by a rattlesnake nest. And the rattlesnake, one of the big rattlesnakes came out and crawled right across his leg and went over to the other side of the tent. And the Indians that were looking inside the tent seen that and thought he was some kind of a spirit because he was not afraid of the snake, and the snake didn't attack him. So they did not kill him. And he ended up, they called him a god after that. And he ended up going back, and he wrote about his meeting of the white people here. And that was down towards the Scranton area. And there was also a ledge, and it's still here, and it's called Bald Mountain over in Newton. And there was a ledge that sticks out, and it even shows it in a book of the Lackawanna Valley. It shows this ledge with a point sticking out where an Indian could camp underneath that ledge, and then supposedly that is where, somewhere around there is where the gold mine was. And salt mines, there was a salt mine going up through the Notch and Clark Summit. Over on the left-hand side, there was a salt mine there. But salt forms underground. And up underneath the Great Lakes, there's gigantic salt deposits. And there's nothing saying that salt wouldn't form underground here. And some of it could be exposed because the glaciers came and they eroded the land. And when it eroded the land, it took it down to the point where it could have been into the salt deposits, where this was, because at one time this was a mile thick of ice right where we are. It was 1 mile thick of glacier ice. And then when it receded, we got the valleys that we have now. So, you know, there's nothing to say that we didn't have a salt mine or two here, and there isn't salt underneath the ground. But the Indians used coal. They used coal to write with. They wrote messages to other Indians in their own languages. They wrote on rocks with coal. They didn't know what coal was for. They didn't know how to use it for fire. but they wrote with it. They found this black ore, and they just wrote on walls, on rocks and different things, and they actually used it. So they actually used coal without knowing what it was. So, you know, yes, there were tales of gold mines, silver mines, lead mines, and salt mines in the area before they found coal.
We were talking about history. A few years ago, you really brought it up as a modern era for me. We were talking about Staples, and many would remember her aunt, Hattie Loftus. Hattie grew up in the Montiel area, and within her lifetime, I can't say just when Hattie died, but it wasn't eons ago. But she remembered Indians in the Montiel area.
They were here, there's no doubt. There's no doubt they were here.
We found arrowheads at Miller's Spring, Wings, Miller's Spring they found
Up
arrowheads.
there at the
Yes.
When there was springs there.
Yep.
Everywhere, we always, my mom went up there, I always followed them.
There's a,
They still there by the spring.
the Indians used those springs. That's where they congregated. They drank the water out of those springs. They talk about a spring that's going through what they call Cobb's Gap, which is when you're going out of Dunmore, going out that way. That's called Cobb's Gap, and the top of that mountain is called Cobb's Mountain. And the Indians used to sit up on that mountain and light their fires there, like they did at Campbell's Ledge. And they talk about it in one of the books about a great spring that no matter what went dry all over the area, when there was no water anyplace else, that spring always had fresh, crystal clear water. And it's all going out through that notch there. And I know there's springs that come out the side of that mountain all the time. We used to go there and get spring water when we were kids. I remember going and filling bottles up there. But the Indians used those springs, and the 40-foot falls over in that area. The Indians camped there. The problem is now they came in here and they mined. When they mined for coal, they ruined this whole area. They strip mined. They dragged big, large drag links, and they went up and they pulled their. You'd be lucky if you found something. We can find fossils. There's still lots of fossils around here. I found some the other day. I found some fern fossils, some tree fossils, and all these coal deposits. There's a vast number of fossils. So I mean, if you ever want to see any, I do have some. In fact, I found some more geodes the other day. And geodes are inside rocks. They're crystal that forms inside rocks. You break them open, and there's crystal in there. I've got quite a few of them that I found, and I just found them by accident. I was digging in some shale, digging a foundation, and all of a sudden a round rock just rolled right out, and all the shale was flat. Everything was layered flat. But this round rock came out, it looked like a little ball, a ball about that big. And then I was digging, another one rolled out, and I couldn't understand how a round rock could be in with all that other rock. But I said, I got to find out what this is, so I took the excavator bucket and I just pounded it until it split, and when I opened it up, there was crystal inside. Pure, beautiful, clear crystal. And that's called a geode. And there's geodes around here all over. In fact, I seen some the other day on the mountain. I actually threw some more in the back. I have 2 more I just put in the truck. So we live in a rich historical area. We just, we don't hear about it. You don't hear about the Indians. You don't hear about any of that stuff. Nobody talks about the Indians. But they were very prevalent in this area. The Seneca, the Iroquois, the Mohawks who lived in New York, they came down here. The Onondagas, the Cayugas, and all the lakes are named after them. The Nanticoke, the Tuscarora, the Shawnee, they all were in this area. Now the ones out west, that's different. These tribes that were here ended up merging with those tribes. When we talk about the Battle of the Little Bighorn and all of that, some of these Indians probably were in that group, or they went to Canada. They went up north, but they all left here and just kept going west. Now, one thing I forgot, and I want to get to it before I quit here, the last Indian settlement in Pennsylvania was called the Corn Planter. Chief Corn Planter was a well-known Indian in this area. He was down in the like Bushkill Falls area, in that area, and it was forced west. And he said he made a treaty with the white people here, And the treaty was that my people would be here, would be able to live here in perpetuity. And the U.S. government agreed to that. Well, they lived up in the western part of the state of Pennsylvania up until 1964. That's when the last Indians in this area left the reservation and left the area. And that was called the Corn Planter Reservation. And the reason for that was they built the Kinzua Dam. And the Kinzua Dam is out in the Allegheny Forest out there, and that was the Seneca Indians. And now you can find the Seneca Indians if you drive the old Route 17 and you travel towards Lake Erie, towards Jamestown, New York, and Erie, Pennsylvania. You will come across these cabins all over along both sides of the road, and you'll say, how could anybody live like that? Those are the Indians. They're still living in little cabins with chimneys, and you see the way they live, and it makes you sick. It makes you sick to see it.
I mean,
But
they're still there?
They're still there. They're not in a reservation, and they don't own the land like they were promised. They're not. They don't have the reservation that they were supposed to have. They live on
Corn planters people?
Corn Planters people are my relatives, actually, the Seneca Indians. And if you go up there, you'll see a place called Salamanca, New York. And right there, you'll find Indians galore. They're all over there in small cabins. They're starting to make a comeback. They're starting to get some of the casinos and get some money to come back. But the Indians live in terrible, terrible situations. They drink heavily, they gamble heavily, they're always fighting people, they still continue to fight, they still continue to live in bad situations in there where you'll see them. I mean, even today when you go there, you still see the way they live, and you're amazed that people can still live like that. But that's all I have. That's the last of my presentation, except for any questions or anything else you want to know. But I find it fascinating, and I love to talk about the Indians, and it's part of history.
When Kinzua Dam was built, it just flooded the whole Indian area.
Yeah, the Army Corps of
A huge
Engineers.
village there.
There was a village there, it was their reservation, and they made them all leave. They just told them, get out, go. They might have gave them some pieces of land, I don't know, but I doubt very much that the government did. If Army Corps of Engineers came in, took all of that land, took all the people. I remember going there with my father because I was born in Jamestown, New York, and I visited my mother in the summer. We used to travel to Jamestown, New York, to Conowongo Valley, which is another Indian name, and that's where I was raised. Indian Little Valley. That's where I grew up as a little boy, and I don't remember it because I was 6 months old when I came back here. But that's where I was born and nurtured as a child. But that's part of the Indian heritage of my family, on my mother's side. So that's it. Thank you for your time.